Hi, this is Eric from QPORIT. Quick previews of random interesting things at the New York Film Festival, posting on the opening night film, The Queen. The press conference, moderated by Richard Pena from the Film Society, with the writer, producer, and director of the film, plus Helen Mirren, who plays the Queen, and James Cromwell, who plays Prince Philip, her husband, was very interesting. And I've always felt the press should not be the only ones to benefit from valuable press events. I've selected highlights from the press conference that will provide some deep insights into the film. Particularly interesting to me in the press conference was the attitude of the writer and director toward the royals and to Tony Blair, which was more complex than I had imagined. I found the film quite moving, and I highly recommend it. There's much more to the film than one might think from just knowing the subject. In fact, a coda at the end of the film, portraying a visit to the Queen by Tony Blair 2 months after the funeral, gives the film entirely new layers of meaning. One note, though, however, is that surprisingly omitted from the film was any discussion at all of the cause of the accident that killed Diana. It's strange that in the film, none of the royals even seem curious, and no questions about that came up at the press conference. Incidentally, although it's not discussed in the press conference, the press notes described the filmmakers as conducting tremendous research into the behavior of the royal family by, among other things, talking to many people that were around them at the time, and even spending some time living in a cottage at Balmoral, the remote estate where the royal family was vacationing when the accident occurred. I've taken out of the press conference a number of pauses and quiet moments, so compared to the press conference itself, this video is a bit more intense. I hope you enjoy this.
On our panel, first of all, we have at the opposite end, producer Andrew Harris. Next to Andrew, screenwriter Peter Morgan. Next to Peter, what can you say? Helen Mirren. Next to Ms. Mirren, the director, Stephen Frears. And next to Stephen Frears, everybody's favorite farmer, James Cromwell. Could you talk about the inspiration for writing The Queen? What was the first event or the first kind of image that came to you when you wanted to start writing the screenplay?
The relationship between the Queen and the Prime Minister. I mean, that was always the thing that particularly interested me. I mean, obviously the Queen is, you know, internationally, well, I suppose Blair has almost as big an international profile, but the fact that once you put those two people in a room together, the very act of them talking, no matter how banal or meaningless the conversation, it immediately has constitutional resonance. And as an Englishman, the idea of putting elected power and inherited power in the same room and to go into those private audiences that they have just seemed irresistible.
Question for Helen Mirren: how did her own political feelings play into her interpretation of the Queen?
Well, actually, you know, I'm not really a very political person in reality. I mean, I think a lot about politics, but I don't commit to politics. I did salute and sort of and was happy about New Labour coming into power because it was a change, and a change was very much needed at that time in Britain. And it was exciting and interesting, and who knew what might come next. So it was an exciting moment. You know, I'm very cynical about politicians, all of them, and so, you know, I was holding out no great hopes for, you know, the utopia of New Labour Britain. In terms of it playing into my relationship, you know, my interpretation, not really. I mean, I think more my feelings about monarchy played into that, and I grew up in a vehemently anti-monarchist family, and I embraced those ideas, and I clung on to them for a very long time, until comparatively recently, really, where I've mellowed somewhat. But playing the role made me think a lot about the value of having a figurehead in that way, and how that figurehead should behave, and all of those thoughts went through my mind.
The metaphor of the stag. How did that?
I'm the stag man. I mean, in all honesty, it came to me when I was, you know, I had a stag moment myself, I'm afraid. Sorry. I don't mean that to be misconstrued. It was a perfectly non-sexual stag moment. But I did have one up an Austrian mountain. I mean, moment, that is, not stag. This is getting worse. I have once been able to answer that question sensibly. You know, there is also a sense, I think, that any stag that has 14 points is one that has evaded capture over a period of time, and that was sort of what, you know, got me interested about in metaphorical terms.
This viewer says that she thinks this film will be especially welcome and be of interest to the Japanese, who of course have their own royal family. But in Japan, there is a law that forbids women from becoming the supreme monarch. And she's wondering now, Miss Mirren has played both Elizabeth I and now Elizabeth II, whether or not she feels that women perhaps are even a little bit more adept at being the monarch of their respective countries.
Well, you know, that's a very big question. I mean, it's very interesting that both Elizabeths came to the throne in a slightly Byzantine way. Obviously, neither of them were destined to be the monarch when they were born. It happened by an accident of history in both cases. And in both cases, there's such extraordinary parallels. They were both 25 when they came to the throne. They both had extremely long reigns, thanks to a very robust constitution. I think it's a luck of the draw, quite honestly. I mean, I think some women, yes, and I think we were very lucky in both our Elizabeths. They were mentally and physically good for the job. But I think some men do it just as well. I think it's all to do with the personality of the person. It's more to do with a human quality rather than a sort of sexual quality. I'm sure some women would be dreadful, ghastly queens, and many have been, actually. So, no, I wouldn't say that it's just because they're women. But I do think that women can be as good as men, without a question. In fact, better. Some women are better than some men.
Stephen, I'm wondering, during the course of the filming, or from the time you first got the screenplay to when you finished the film, what do you think changed in the film for you? Was there something that, as the actors assumed the roles, maybe surprised you about the way the final film came out?
Well, that always happens in a film, that the actors bring them to life in some way it's always much richer and more interesting and more complex than you expect. I think probably my sympathy or empathy, is that the right word? For the Queen probably deepened because of Helen's performance. That would be all. But the actors always take you by surprise. Generally good ones. She's talking nonsense in our last answer. There have been 4 English queens, and there were 2 Elizabeths and Victoria, and the 3rd was Queen Anne, who was insignificant. But actually it's very, very striking that no English king has come anywhere near to any of these queens.
Yeah, that's true.
The most vicious queen was George IV.
Okay, question is that it's been a year where we've seen here in the U.S. films made on real events such as 9/11, and this of course is based on real characters. We have the Queen, we have the Prime Minister, and the question is, what particular difficulties did the filmmakers find in making a film like this, or do they expect to find? Andrew, maybe I'll ask you about that. When you started on this, were there ever questions about I don't know about legalities and censorship. I mean, how much can you say about people who are still living? I know your laws are different from our laws on issues like that.
Yes, it was a good question. I mean, I think what appealed to us at the beginning was, in a sense, the audaciousness, if you like, of making a film about a living monarch. No one had ever done it. The Queen only ever been depicted once in a television play by Alan Bennett about 20 years ago. So once we started to think about it, we did get sort of incredibly excited and incredibly intrigued by whether we could do it, and why would we not be able to do it in a sense. There is no history of the royal family censoring people or using any legal powers to kind of stop projects about them. But obviously we did talk to lawyers, etc., etc. But in the end, we felt that it was entirely justified. I did actually call the palace very early on and just explain to them what we were up to. And there was sort of an awfully long pause, as you can imagine. And I just sort of rattled away for about 10 minutes, just trying to, going on about how good director Stephen Frears was and what a quality project this was, and that Helen was, going to do justice to the Queen, etc., etc., etc. And the silence went on and on and on. And she just finally said that the chief press officer, well, we don't comment about these sort of things. And that's basically it. We offered them a print. I don't know if they've seen it yet or not, but I suspect they probably will. I have a sneaking suspicion that they will screen it one night in Buckingham Palace and all sit around and see what they think. But that's basically it. The only real difficulty, I suppose, about trying to film it was that when we were looking for locations in Scotland, we quickly discovered that basically every castle that looked anything like Balmoral was in some way owned or connected to someone, the royal family, and the shutters went up very, very fast. So we discovered that the only places we were going to be able to film were places that were owned by foreigners, which is what we did.
Good to know the Queen had director approval.
She insisted on it.
Who else was on the shot then? She wouldn't have wanted Ken
Questions about the use of the actuality footage, the newsreel footage that's interspersed in the film, and especially the use of Diana's brother giving his eulogy. Why show that actual footage as opposed to having an actor recite those lines?
Well, it was written into the script, so Peter should answer that question. But it was then overseen by a fantastic documentary director called Alan Curtis, who made The Power of Nightmares last year. The question about Spencer is interesting. There was actually a conversation about whether we should cast him. I would be very, very surprised if we could have got sort of half the power into it from an actor. I don't mean because the actors aren't wonderful. I just mean that the authenticity was very helpful. He had to give his permission, which, thank you very much.
With regard to the archive footage, I mean, the answer, I suppose, is twofold. Firstly, to film some of those scenes, and any film version of this story without seeing how many people were actually outside Buckingham Palace, without seeing how many flowers were outside Kensington Palace and so forth, would just simply be inadequate. So either we had a $200 million film on our hands, which would involve shutting down London, or we do this. So on the one hand, it was sort of pragmatic and being cheap. On the other hand, the media was a character in this, and I hope that you get that from the film. That the way in which the agenda was being dictated both by the press and the way in which the press was also responding. It was really interesting. Nobody in this story was leading. Everybody was sort of leading and following simultaneously. Everybody was watching how the others, there was Buckingham Palace, there was the media, there was the royal family, and everybody was peering, it seemed, waiting to see how the next person would move. And at the heart of it all was this sort of ludicrous behaviour by the British people. It seems now, not at the time, but now when you look back, you sort of go, where did that come from? And to which degree that was fueled by, rolling news, and we were all just getting used to 24-hour news coverage at this point, I mean, of course it was there First Gulf War, but it really found its apotheosis that week. And you know, I knew that people would watch events unfold on television the way that we all do now. As soon as a landmark event happens, we go to our televisions and the entire world is united through television screens in a very strange way. That's how we experience the world now.
James Cromwell, I'm wondering, we have some image of Elizabeth because we see her, you know, on TV, but I at least have far fewer kind of markers for Prince Philip. I'm wondering what you used in order to create the character.
Well, I used the script. But I did have an opportunity to meet Prince Philip and the Queen and Charles and have a conversation and hear him speak about something that I found very compelling, and I was impressed by his commitment to what he was talking about. I think many people in England seem to hold him in some disregard because of his proclivity to put his foot in his mouth on some occasions, but I found him very compelling, and everything that I saw in the documentaries only reinforced that. He takes his job incredibly seriously, and so I tried to bring, I think Stephen, I don't want to speak for him, but I think the idea was not to caricature him and to, given the latitude of the script, I tried to bring as much forbearance and dignity and appropriateness and real care and concern for the woman that he loves to the part.
Question for the writer and for the director. There's a sense in which both Mr. and Mrs. Blair in the film are weak characters, and is perhaps later disappointment with Tony Blair something that comes out through the characterization of them 10 years earlier?
I mean, you know, yes. I mean, equally, we couldn't do a hatchet job on him that we wanted to, or you know, because this was his sort of finest hour in that sense. And to pretend that he handled that week badly would just be irresponsible and inaccurate. I mean, I think he conducted himself, and his administration conducted himself extraordinarily well. And having said that, we did look for opportunities to try and express some of our, I mean, that is to say, when he came to power, he was like the Messiah. People were very excited about that. I'm sure you remember here. And, you know, we certainly were very excited in London. I remember that particular summer, it just never rained. It just seemed to be, you know, Blair and Oasis and the sunshine, and, you know, and at a stroke, all those old, at a stroke, all those old-fashioned Tories like Michael Heseltine, whatever, they just were these dinosaurs that vanished overnight. And this was a modern, exciting Britain. But our experience of that, as you know, I don't need to explain. We're all profoundly disappointed in Tony Blair and what the new Labour dream and administration has become, and what they've done to, you know, international law and human. I mean, it's just, you know, so actually part of the conservatizing of Tony Blair we tried to do in microcosm in this story. That is to say, he comes in promising radical modernization and reform, and ends up actually propping up, you know, the monarchy.
He was okay in the 20th century, he's had trouble in the 21st.
That's about right. I mean, Bush wasn't around then.
Which is why it's clear to us that we should have a vote in the American elections rather than the British ones.
Question for Helen Mirren. What was the process of getting into the character, the research she did?
Well, you know, it's the normal kind of thing. I mean, you read a lot, you watch a lot of video. We were very lucky to have a wonderful voice coach called Penny Dyer, who'd worked with Peter and Stephen on a film called The Deal that they made about Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. And the actors were, the same actor played Tony Blair in that film. Both actors were absolutely superb, and I'd seen that and been very impressed by it, and worked with the same dialogue coach. And she's truly brilliant woman who who teaches voice through psychology rather than just through sound. And of course that's the great actor's way into a voice. So that was the first step, was to try and get near the voice. And then, you know, you can, and that voice has been imitated so often and satirized. And, you know, my husband and I, it's what we're all used to making fun of. But to find the truth in the voice, it doesn't sound like a silly sort of caricature, was important anyway. Watching video, looking at portraits, and thinking a lot. I found myself very drawn to the Queen as a young girl, and really I spent most of my time researching what she was like when she was young before she ever had any idea that she was going to be Queen. Because I thought that would probably reveal the true character of the person, the truth of her personality, before that mantle descended on her shoulders.
Question for James Cromwell, Helen Mirren, and Stephen Frears. How did each of their sympathies ebb and flow during this in terms of their relationship to all the characters?
You sort of can't... If you're British, the royal family, it's very, very complicated. They are laughed at non-stop, and they are, in many respects, quite ridiculous. On the other hand, you can't make a film from any position other than one of sympathy for or curiosity about the sort of human beings that are underneath it all. I mean, just to make fun of them, well, I say that's what most people do. The extraordinary thing about this film is it takes them seriously. That already is a sort of shockingly original thing to have done. So, you know, in the end, there's a sort of, I don't know where the line, you draw the line, because I like the jokes just as much as anybody else does. So the jokes are always the tricky point, because they're so funny and so irresistible, but of course they force you inexorably down, maybe down a more caricature-ish path. But you sort of have to start being on the side of the characters, don't you? All the characters.
Well, I mean, inevitably, and actually, Michael Sheen, who plays Tony Blair, it describes exactly the same thing. As an actor, you inevitably kind of fall in love with your character, no matter who it is. Even if it's Macbeth, you know, you find reasons to love them the way we all find reasons to love ourselves. So that was sort of certainly what happened with me. I found myself absolutely loving the Queen. And no, it's embarrassing for me to do that. You know, it's not very cool.
Yes, we're now a sort of disgrace.
Yes, no, we are.
But you're all Republicans. You should be ashamed of yourself. Perhaps you burnt down the cinema. Strung us up.
As an American, my sympathies originally were with Diana, because my experience of her, as most Americans and most people in the world, is from the distance that the press, I mean, that's how I experienced her, not personally. And what I noticed happen in the film was that I realized that that family knew her in a way that almost nobody else did. Whatever her transgressions were in terms of that family, they felt them deeply, and it justified the behavior that they then manifested. So you have this sort of push-pull. I sympathize with their dilemma. At the same time, I think my observation is of an incredibly dysfunctional family that has caused immeasurable harm to the children, and I think as an American, I suppose the Brits feel the same way. I think that's a shame and a waste, and I'm sorry it had to contribute somewhat to her demise.
Speaking of the children, actually I found the creation of the part of Charles very, very touching. I didn't expect when I started watching the movie that I'd feel sympathy for him, but I wound up feeling a lot of sympathy for him in the film. It's a wonderful performance and also just the way it's written. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I've had feedback this week from his friends. It's come to me through various sources, and they're really pissed off. So I'm delighted that you are that you found it to be sympathetic. I mean, I think we tried and tried and tried. In fact, had the Charles that we originally shot, remained in the film in its entirety, the subplot, the storyline, it was more inflammatory. In fact, this material is like a sort of haemophiliac. It bruises so easily. If you just touch it, you suddenly get a huge swelling. You suddenly realize, God, we have to. Even though I think the scenes in themselves weren't inflammatory, the fact that Charles was making a phone call from the cockpit of the aeroplane in which Diana's coffin was being brought back from Paris, and then he was on the phone to Camilla Parker Bowles, it just seemed so, shocking. And that in the end, Stephen's decision to take all that stuff out seemed really, really smart. Just because we were trying to protect him from the haemophiliac nature of himself in that sense. People tell me he's, and I've never met him, but people tell me that well, his allies tell me that he's more substantial and significant than perhaps I portrayed. But let me tell you, so many of his detractors spoke to me that I thought, I tried, and we all tried, just to navigate our way through this toxic bitchery that we got. Every time we went to speak to anybody, there were they were spinning like crazy, all these various palaces, and it was very difficult sometimes to see a kind of neutral, human, halfway compassionate, realistic line through that.
Just to add, I think that we were very lucky in Alex Jennings, who plays Prince Charles, because he knows Prince Charles, he respects him, and I think he was, in his playing of that character, he was always fighting Prince Charles's corner as an actor, and I think that also helped. I felt he really humanized him. He brought an emotional content to that character that I felt was very, very valuable.
Okay, I'm afraid that's all we have time for because we have to move on. I want to thank everyone on the panel very much for coming.
So I hope you found this press conference as interesting as I did. We'd love to hear your comments. Visit us for a while at QPORIT and post your comments there. Thanks for watching.